When Equatorial Guinea achieved independence in 1968, its new beginning turned out to be the start of a nightmare that continues to this day. Hundreds of thousands of people would be driven into prisons, into exile, or into their graves at the behest of one insane man, Francisco Macias Nguema. In this video, we'll show you how this deranged man turned his country into the Auschwitz of Africa. So stick around to learn about the mad dictator who dined with the dead and turned Santa Claus into an accomplice in his unspeakable crimes. And don't forget to like this video to show your support for our content. Macias had been a simple clerk and translator under Spanish rule. He was shamelessly corrupt, but his favors to the right people saw him climb the hierarchy of power. Still, anyone who knew him could tell something was wrong. Macias was egotistical and paranoid with absurd political views. During a conference on independence in Madrid in the 1960s, Macias declared that he saw Hitler as the savior of Africa and a warrior against imperialism. He also described himself as a Hitlerian Marxist, combining the economic policy of the German philosopher with the authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism of the German dictator. None of this prevented him reaching the office of Deputy Prime Minister in the transitional government set up in 1964. And when the time came to campaign for the election of Equatorial Guinea's first independent president in 1968, Macias was well placed to win. Macias channeled fierce nationalism and anti-Spanish attitudes, and appealed to voters with his aggressive and blunt rhetoric. Macias would stand on a rally stage in a town, point to a European's house, and promise voters that he'd take all European property and give it to his supporters. It was an easy sell, and in September 1968, Macias soared to victory to become the president of Equatorial Guinea. Like so many dictators before him, the first thing Macias did was eliminate threats to his power. His rival in the election, a man named Bonifacio Ondo Edu, was accused of coup plotting and arrested, along with a number of other officials and ministers. They were all executed or left to die in prison. They were the first to be accused of plotting against Macias, but far from the last. Just like Macias's opponent sought safety, we too seek security in the digital world, where our personal data is exposed. Type your personal email address into Google right now, and you'll probably find a couple of websites exposing your information. Unsettling, right? If you've ever found your home address on a public website during a Google search, you know the unsettling feeling that follows. This video is proudly sponsored by Aura, offering comprehensive digital security that helps you put a stop to this. Reclaim your privacy. Your info is exposed because of data brokers, who profit from selling your personal information. But Aura can step in, identify these brokers, and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. But Aura isn't just about handling data brokers. It's an all-in-one online security solution. Forget juggling separate apps for parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, or identity theft insurance. Aura combines all these into one easy-to-install, affordable package. With Aura, your online transactions are secure, your identity is safeguarded, and your personal data remains private. This gives you the freedom to focus on life's other important tasks without worry. And now, a special offer for A Day in History viewers. Exclusive 14-day free access to Aura's ultimate protection. Click the link in the video description, claim this gift, and keep yourself and your family secure in the digital age. In February 1969, Foreign Minister Atanasio Ndongo was accused of a different coup attempt. Macias's guards cornered him in the cabinet room, where the official story claims he leapt from a window to his death. Other witnesses insisted that Macias's guards killed him, or that Macias himself threw the man from the window. Numerous others were implicated in this supposed conspiracy, including Saturnino Ibongo, the country's UN ambassador, who was recalled to the country and executed minutes after getting off the plane. Of the 12 men who made up Macias's first cabinet, only 2 would live to see his fall, and by 1971, over 2/3 of the original 1968 National Assembly had disappeared, never to be heard from again. Macias quickly allied himself to many of the other worst regimes of the world, especially the USSR, Cuba, and North Korea. He allowed Moscow to use his country to smuggle weapons to conflicts across Africa, and had 200 elite Cuban soldiers serving as advisors and personal guards. Macias even sent his daughter to be educated in North Korea, where Kim Il-sung personally supervised the girl's education. With no real opponents to speak of, it was a simple matter for Macias to secure his own power. In 1970, he outlawed all existing political parties and consolidated his own into the Partido Único Nacional de Trabajadores, PUNT. He also created a youth paramilitary force called the Juventud en Marcha con Macias, which acted as an equivalent to Hitler's Brown Shirts or Mao's Red Guards. He also stripped away the legal limits on his power, a story that will be familiar to anyone who has studied dictators before. Between 1971 and 1973, Macias assumed the powers of the legislature, executive, and judicial branches of government, made it illegal to criticize his regime, and granted himself total power to call or dismiss the National Assembly, to appoint or dismiss judges, or to order arrests and executions for any reason. This also came with an impressive suite of titles: President for Life, Head of the Nation and Party, Grand Master of Education, Science and Culture, and his personal favorite, the Unique Miracle. Macias set about remaking his country to fit his delusions and eccentricities. He closed off a large part of the capital city of Malabo into a presidential zone that the public were forbidden from entering, a move equal parts vanity and paranoia. Private businesses were suppressed and foreign trade collapsed. With no real economy to speak of, the people of Equatorial Guinea were reduced to a primitive bartering system, where exploitation, theft, and starvation were commonplace. The desperate and fearful population were forced into military exercises to fulfill Macias's vision of a powerful and revolutionary nation. In 1971, all citizens were required to practice daily with wooden rifles, and from 1976, all children between 7 and 14 had to submit to mandatory military training. Any child or parent who refused his training would be imprisoned or shot. The intellectual class was a particular target of Macias's regime. Macias deeply distrusted the educated class and called them the greatest problem facing Africa today. He accused them of polluting our climate with foreign culture. Thousands of people with university degrees or skilled occupations were imprisoned or executed at his command. Western clothes, food, music, and even medicine were banned for being un-African. Doctors were especially distrusted as agents of Western medicine, and Western thinking and almost all of the country's medical professionals faced exile, a jail cell, or prison. By 1979, there were only 2 doctors left in the whole country. The church did not escape the dictator's wrath either. Macias believed missionaries and priests were imperialist agents who were corrupting the nation and turning them against the regime. In 1974, he passed a law strictly limiting all religious gatherings and ordered militiamen and party loyalists to, quote, watch the subversive activities of the Catholic and other missionaries. What little preaching that was permitted had to be pre-approved, and priests were expected to sing Macias's praises in their sermons. Eventually, all churches were legally required to display a photo of the dictator in every place of worship. Macias's persecution of religion did not stop his own religious delusions though, and in 1978, the country's official motto became there is no other god than Macias Nguema. For the common people of Equatorial Guinea, there was no chance of justice. By 1972, the country's judges had been purged, and all trials were conducted by party loyalists who saw disloyalty everywhere. It's no surprise that tens of thousands tried their luck by fleeing the country. As much as 25% of the country's population left as refugees into neighboring territories. Macias sent soldiers to hunt them down and bring them back, but there were so many that he could never hope to stem the tide. Officially, Macias claimed that these refugees didn't exist, and if they did, they were foreign agents trying to make him look bad. In a rare interview given to a BBC journalist, Macias claimed that the stories of refugees were smears by the Spanish government against his country. That didn't stop Macias ordering the only road leading out of the country to be covered in landmines. Nor did it stop his soldiers constructing spike pits along the border to catch unsuspecting escapees. While Macias claimed to be a leader for all of Equatorial Guinea, he was biased towards his own Fang ethnicity, and often persecuted the smaller ethnic groups within his country. For example, when the tiny Pagalu tribe faced a cholera epidemic, he cut off any medical or financial aid to them, which resulted in hundreds of deaths. He also took revenge on the inhabitants of the island of Annobon. Most of them had voted against him in 1968, so Macias ordered mass arrests that decimated the island's population. The Bubi people of Bioko faced particular persecution. Alongside imprisonment, seizure of private property, and other abuses, Macias targeted Bubi leaders to cripple their community. Pastor Torao Sikara, one of the most important Bubi chiefs, was imprisoned and died of thirst. Another leading Bubi politician named Enrique Gori Molubela was left to die of an infection after Macias's forces gouged his eyes out. Meanwhile, Edmundo Bocio Bioko, leader of the Union Bubi, mysteriously died in prison where witnesses claimed he'd been tortured and killed by Macias's soldiers. The Bubi were important because the island of Bioko was home to the country's main industry, cocoa production. The cocoa industry relied heavily on migrant laborers from Nigeria, who earned a reputation for hard work and dependability. This made the Nigerians disproportionately wealthy and a tempting target for the regime. It was easy for Macias to fan the flames of ethnic violence against a wealthy foreign minority, and dozens of Nigerians were killed in mob attacks in the early 1970s. In one case, Macias's soldiers shot 11 Nigerian nationals at the country's embassy. The Nigerian government was disgusted and saw to the evacuation of tens of thousands of their citizens by sea and air. This created a problem. As much as Macias's regime liked to persecute the Nigerians and Bubi, they needed to make up the labor shortfall for the cocoa industry. Their solution was an old one: slavery. Thousands were pressed into forced labor on cocoa plantations or farms as the country's economy faltered. Whole villages were arrested and shipped away to Bioko. In 1973, the regime's target for forced labor was 60,000 people. However, with starvation, disease, escapes, and mass imprisonment, finding that labor force was more difficult than they expected. Girls as young as 14 were pushed into service as the industry continued to collapse in the 1970s. But even this wasn't enough. Cocoa production fell to a fraction of its pre-independence level and destroyed the country's failing economy with it. Those who didn't end up on the plantations ended up in prisons. Scholars estimate that half of the country's population was arrested at one point or another over the flimsiest of charges. Even owning a cut of Spanish ham could earn you a 5-year prison sentence. Black Beach Prison was the most infamous detention center, where many more people entered than ever left. Macias filled it with political prisoners and placed his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, in charge of prisoners. Obiang personally tortured prisoners for his own amusement, but the tiny number of survivors from the prison offer only a glimpse of the horrors they endured. One survivor described how prisoners were forced to dance around a fire for hours on end, while the guards laughed and jeered. They danced until they collapsed into the fire, at which point the guards heated iron rods in the flames and beat the prisoners until they got up, or until they were never going to rise again. Another survivor claimed to have personally seen 157 prisoners beaten to death from his cell alone. Despite the harshness of his prison system, Macias believed, or claimed to believe, that they were a source of constant unrest. Political prisoners were regularly accused of coup attempts and anti-government plots that were used to justify immediate executions. One alleged plot occurred in Bata jail in June 1974, where 114 political prisoners had somehow contacted foreign agents and were on the verge of trying to overthrow the government. Most were killed during a supposed uprising on June 10th, and most of the rest took their own way out when they were caught. No concrete witnesses of the supposed rebellion survive. However, the regime did present confessions from the prisoners that meticulously detailed their guilt. These confessions were said to be delivered before a tribunal, despite the fact that this tribunal occurred several weeks after most of the confessors had died. As his country slid into chaos and despair, Macias fell ever further into madness. He'd always been unstable, but with no restraints on his power and total freedom to do as he pleased to anyone who displeased him, Macias's madness became unbearable. For example, when the director of the Institute of Statistics presented data that the president didn't like, Macias had the man dismembered so that he could, quote, learn how to count. When the governor of the central bank displeased him, Macias ordered him to be detained and his home village burned to the ground before the man was executed. In 1977, two villages of Embe and Ekoquete had resisted the abuses of his men, so Macias had their entire populations exterminated. He also passed a law demanding execution for anyone caught wearing glasses, and made the word intellectual illegal. Macias made some types of fishing illegal too, because he worried that people would use the fishing boats to escape. By the late 1970s, Macias trusted no one. His inner circle was made up entirely of family members, and he abandoned the capital in favor of a massified fortified estate in his home village. The estate was guarded by his loyal foreign soldiers, and he maintained a prison for 300 inmates who he would torture or execute at his leisure, often by his own hands. Hidden away in his estate, Macias practiced magic fong rituals, where he prayed to the skulls of the dead, hoping to absorb their power. His obsession with magic went as far as necromancy. In one memorable episode, he ordered his staff to lay a table for 8 people, and then sat alone at the table for hours, claiming that he was speaking to the spirits of the dead who'd come to dinner. His most famous crime came on Christmas Eve 1969, in the National Football Stadium. Macias had 186 alleged dissidents brought into the stadium, blasted some music over the speakers, and ordered his soldiers to open fire. According to some sources, every soldier was dressed as Santa Claus for the occasion. 150 people were shot, the gunfire competing with the idyllic lyrics of Mary Hopkins' 1969 hit, "Those Were the Days, My Friend," echoing throughout the stadium. Macias had the remaining 36 men dig a hole for themselves, in which they were buried up to their necks and eaten alive by hordes of ants. After 11 years of his deranged rule, Equatorial Guinea was a mess. The government barely functioned, there was almost no money in the entire country, practically no official records were being kept, and even Macias' own bodyguards had to hunt and scavenge for food in order to survive. only a fraction of the country had running water or electricity, and there was no effective long-distance communication within or beyond the country's borders. Large portions of the population were in prison, assuming they hadn't fled, and many more lay in unmarked graves, hastily buried by Macias's thugs. Fearing that he would be the next victim of his uncle's paranoia, Macias's sadistic nephew and former overseer of Black Beach Prison, Bonifacio Nguema, launched a coup in August 1979. Macias's bodyguards remained loyal at first, but soon abandoned him when they saw that Obiang had the support of practically everyone. Macias fled into the jungle with a suitcase full of cash, where he was eventually found, alone and delirious. Before he fled, he'd burned almost $100 million as petty revenge, destroying perhaps the majority of the country's cash reserves. Obiang's men captured him, and soon Macias was on trial for genocide, mass murder, embezzlement of public funds, torture of political prisoners, and burning entire villages. It was little more than a show trial. Everyone knew he was guilty. Citizens flooded into the courtroom and shouted out stories of his crimes as the trial went on. He was convicted and sent to Black Beach Prison on September 29, 1979 to be executed. After so many years of his insanity and secret occult practices, the authorities couldn't actually find native soldiers brave enough to kill him. They were scared that the mad president would haunt them beyond the grave. Instead, a group of Moroccan mercenaries were summoned and shot him just 6 hours after his sentencing. Macias joined thousands of his own victims in the graves of Black Beach Prison. In 1969, Equatorial Guinea had a population of about 280,000 people. Within 12 years, about 50,000 of them would be dead, if not 80,000. A further 25% fled as refugees, many of whom never returned. Per capita GDP fell by an estimated 90%, infant mortality soared by 60%, and life expectancy was just 30 years old. Macias turned his homeland into a nightmare and earned it the nickname of the Auschwitz of Africa, and he's been described as Africa's Pol Pot. Obiang's new regime condemned Macias, but it did not change much. Equatorial Guinea remains one of the least developed countries in the world, with an appalling record of torture, executions, and abuse. Obiang is still in power today, and continues to practice the same brutality that he learned from his work under his uncle's regime. Even Macias's daughter is still alive, and is still writing books praising the virtues of her father's monstrous regime and that of North Korea where she grew up. Macias may be dead, but the story of the horrors he and his family inflicted on his country is far from over. Unlike an Equatorial Guinean Santa Claus, we bring good surprises like more videos on topics like this one. Leave a like and subscribe to keep up to date and get notified for more exciting dives into history.